Hi everybody. In today's video we're going to go through how to convert carpeted stairs to these hardwood floor stairs, including the installation of stair skirts as well as this super sweet LED light feature on the bottom of this trim. Overall I'd say it's about an intermediate level project, and it's going to really depend on the kind of finishes you're looking to do for your stairs. As we go through the video I'll go through some of the tools I used, and you can decide the best tool to use in your particular case. Alright, let's get to it.
So here's a look at the layout of the stairs. I'm going to be using the existing structural treads and risers. I'm going to be covering the treads with some engineered hardwood flooring using this 3/8 inch brushed hickory made by Home Legend that I got from Home Depot. For the stair nose pieces, I'm going to be using this unfinished red oak that I got from Floor & Decor with a bullnose edge. So this stair nose has a 3/4 inch bull nose on it that's designed to sit flush against the riser, which means I need to remove the existing overhang that the treads have on my structural stairs so that this will be able to sit in that flush position. And I'm going to be covering the existing risers with 1/2 inch MDF board. Alright, so the first step of this project was to remove the existing carpet. Not a whole lot to this other than just got to get your fingers under the carpet where it starts and just pull with a decent amount of force. I did end up using a hammer in a few spots to get it started, and then once I got some carpet to pull on, I got a little more leverage. I could free it loose of those billions of staples that were holding it down. Once it's removed, I'm taking out the pads that also were under the carpet here, just ripping them out by hand. Now I'm going back and removing all the wooden spike strips that were holding the carpet in place just with a hammer and a pry bar. And every little bit of carpet pad you can see still remaining there is a staple that I need to remove by hand. So I'm just using the staple removing tool and a hammer to knock all those out. And this was no small task. I would say this probably took, 4 to 5 hours from bottom to top of my staircase. So I'm going a little bit out of order here, but if I'm going to be painting materials as part of a project, I like to get the coat of primer on a little bit early. That way it will be dry and ready to paint once I get to that point of using them. So here I'm just putting a coat of primer on all the different materials I plan on painting, which I'll go into more in detail on what all these are later in the video.
So to mark out where I'm going to make the cut, all I'm going to do, just use a reference board, back it up to the back of the riser, just going to make a scribe, and then just going to line that same scribe up with the front edge here. Just make my mark. Going to do the same on the other side. Alright, I'm going to take my track for my track saw, line the two. Haven't been drinking too much. Then I'm going to line up each edge with the marks that I made.
So I bought this track saw pretty much for this project with the thought that I'm going to use it for future projects. And I gotta say, this thing is awesome. It's one of my favorite tools that I've ever bought. It's definitely worth the investment so far that I've used it. And my first thought when I bought it is like, man, what am I paying? I don't know what it was, $500 I want to say, for a tool that I already have. I already have a couple circular saws. I really didn't know what the major difference was other than it just keeps it a straight cut. But I gotta say, it really is a big difference. Just having that total control over your cut and just being able to align it on a track. It's such a great tool. I highly recommend it if you're looking to get more into woodworking. Definitely performs a lot of different cuts that might be more difficult with other tools. Just makes it real easy. With that being said, I'm doing about 80% of the cut with the track saw itself. I can't get it all the way to the wall just because of the way the blade is structured, the way the blade is situated. So I'm actually using a couple other tools to finish off the cuts here. I'm using a jigsaw to cut it as close to the wall as I can while keeping it pretty straight, and then just finally finishing it off with this multi-oscillating tool from DeWalt here, just clipping that little bit of the remaining stair nose off. And also just a quick note, I'm not getting these cuts 100% flush with the riser. It's usually about within an 1/8 or 1/16 of an inch. It's going to be fine for how I'm going to install the risers, so I'm not too concerned about getting it perfect. I'm just getting as close as I can with the tools that I have.
Okay, so I'm just going to walk through real quickly how I marked out my stair skirt. So after I had the noses cut off, I just brought in my board here and laid it, just staged it here along the stair edges so it's sitting on the angle of the stairs. To mark out these lines, I just took my square here, butted it in the corner, marked the straight line, and same thing for, that was for the rise, same thing for the line of the stairs, just butt it in the corner, and then mark out this bottom line. So in theory, I'm just going to cut right along those lines and it should slide in. The one risk with this methodology is that if you think about how this is being marked, so I have this height here, which is ultimately going to slide down into this stair. This height here is really the height of this stair, of the stair above it, since this line here is the top of the tread on the stair above it. So when it slides down, that's assuming that this height here, when it slides into this stair, is going to be the same height as this. So there's definitely some assumptions I'm making that these stairs are all roughly the same height. I did just check them and they're all within about 1/4 inch of each other. So really this cut doesn't need to be perfect. I just need it to be able to sit in the stairs close enough, about 1/2 inch tolerance, I'd say, for the trim I'm using.
So to cut out the stair skirts, I'm going to use my track saw again, which in retrospect, not the best choice. It is pretty bulky and pretty heavy to kind of shift around and do these quick cuts. Definitely recommend a circular saw here. And I got a little carried away using it, and if you notice here, the saw is not on the track, which is kind of an important thing to do when you're using this tool. So yeah, I made a nice little groove in my straight edge there on my track saw, one I just recently bought, so that was nice. But we press on, and not going to be a huge deal in the long run. Should cut pretty straight. So the saw can't get all the way in the corners. There's usually a little bit of wood remaining, so I'm just cutting out that last little bit of wood with the jigsaw here. So I had an idea to cut a dado groove into the side of my stair skirts and baseboards and paint it black. I just thought it would give it kind of a modern look and create a cool continuous line up the stairs. So here I'm just cutting them out on my table saw at a depth of about 1/4 inch and a width of about 2 saw blades. So I'm doing 2 different passes and about 1.25 inches from the top of the stair skirt and baseboards.
So here is a look at the stair skirts after they have been cut out. I had this real doozy of a cut here where I cut way deeper than I should have. I just was asleep at the wheel and kept going, and also tried to realign at one point and created this nice little jagged edge here. To fix this, I'm just going to go ahead and use some wood filler. I have wood filler in there for now, so when you paint it, you won't actually see it. To get around these gaps, what I'm going to do is hardwood flooring here, which is 1/4 inch thick, and then I have just a piece of cove molding that I'm going to have on each stair. That's going to sit right in there, and it's going to cover that gap. The molding serves a couple of purposes. For one, it just makes my life easier so I don't have to be totally precise with these cuts, and two is I think aesthetically they just look better. I'm going to make one last cut here to where this stair skirt will run cleanly into my baseboards. My baseboard is going to be this 1x6 pine here. I have a sample section, and that's where I've made my mark, and that's where I'll make my cut.
So now it is time for my favorite part of any project, and that is painting. So painting is going to involve brushing all the dust and any particles that landed on this board while I was working in the garage, And now I'm going to paint the dados first. I'm going to paint the dados black, and the main face of the stair skirts is going to be white. I am going to mask off the dados at first, as close as I can, so a bit of time-consuming, tedious effort here to get the masking tape on close. Still not going to be perfect. I'm still going to get paint on the face of it. It's just going to be part of it, but I want to reduce that paint, so when I do come back with the white, it will be as little of covering of the black as I have to do. And here I am also doing the baseboards and the stair skirts, painting them at the same time. And I'm just using a black semi-gloss paint with a brush, pretty bit straightforward, getting as much paint in there as I can to get it nice and full, and just doing one coat and removing the masking tape immediately before it dries so it comes off a little bit easier. So after I got the dados painted black, I need to paint the face of them white. In order to not get any paint in those dados, I'm basically just going over it with a foam roller and putting a very light amount of paint on it while taking the majority of the paint in this thick part. Then when I eventually do go over the dado, there should be a very little paint on there so it doesn't drip in that dado. So those stair skirts are ready to go. I'm going to install them to the studs using a brad nailer and a stud finder using 18 gauge 2-inch brads. And I'm just firing that nail right through the dado so I don't actually have to fill the holes because you don't see them. Not something I planned, but it's very nice.
So right now I'm working on this transition piece that's going to connect the lower stair skirt to the upper stair skirt here. It's kind of an awkward transition just because of the heights of the board. So I'm taking an offcut of my 1x8. Just gonna place it in there where I want it. I'm gonna continue this angle from the bottom section. The height. So the piece is basically gonna be cut here, here, and then a little bit of height, so it's going to have a flat area as it connects.
After marking out this piece, I'm just taking it to the miter saw, making my width cut, my mitered cut here for the turn at the top of the stairs, and then just a little bit of height for that final dimension. I also wanted to keep that dado that I have on the other stair skirts and the baseboards continuous, so I had to mark out the dado on this piece so that it would continuously go from the bottom section to the middle section. After marking it out, I'm just being real careful on the table saw to try and cut out that groove and remove that material. So apart from the transition pieces, I did cut out the remainder of the baseboards without a ton of issue. I just used a tape measure, measure the gaps. In this case, and a couple other cases, I did have to cut them at a bit of an angle, you can see, because the wall is at a bit of an angle. So I just cut them to length and slid them in. But it was at this point I did realize that there was an issue here. The dados that I cut earlier didn't line up, and I do what I always do in these cases, and I just sit there and stare at the problem. And I had to draw back on some of my extensive math education here to understand what exactly was happening.
Here's a problem I didn't anticipate. When I cut out the dados on the table saw, I kept the distance for the stair skirts and the baseboards all the same. So this distance is the same, but when you change the angle, so when I cut the stair skirts at whatever angle they're at, changes the distance of the line. So this distance is not the same as this. I need to recut the baseboards. I'm just going to use the back sides of them. Still will be salvageable. I'll have the dado lined up on this side.
So now it's time to give some love to the stair noses. I am going to go with stain here because I like the grain of that red oak, and I am actually not going to match the hickory hardwood flooring, but instead I'm going to go with black for my stair noses. So with stain, you definitely want to make sure that your materials have been sanded down to at least 220 grit, and I usually highly recommend using that stain preconditioner. I think it helps to get a nice even coat. In my case, my wood was already pre-sanded, so I didn't need to do that. And I'm also just going with black and a couple coats of black, so it's not going to be that high of a risk of blotchiness. So here I'm just coming back and doing 2 coats using one of those staining pads. But you really can use anything. You can use shirts, rags, cats, whatever you can get your hands on. I'm also going to be staining the cove molding here. That'll be part of the trim of the stairs. One thing I'll say about staining, make sure you wipe up that excess stain that pulls up after the stain has soaked in. It'll definitely get all gunky and will make your project look bad. So the finish I applied to the stair noses was this water-based polyurethane. I did 4 coats. After filming this, I did notice the noses were getting scuffed up from normal wear and tear. So I did go back and refinish these with some Varathane floor finish, but the application's exactly the same. I used a brush, just like how I'm showing here. Nice and slow, easy strokes with lighter coats. One thing I would recommend is always have your work area clean before you do these kind of projects.
God damn it.
So I was getting dust landing in my finish as it was drying, which is no good because that's how it's going to dry, and you would have to sand it down and redo it if it dried that way. But cleaned up the area, now back to it. Here's the final look at them after the 4 coats, but like I said, I did have to sand it and refinish it with the floor finish after I installed, which is always fun. As I mentioned earlier, I'm using 1/2-inch MDF board for my risers. After priming and painting a couple 4x8 sheets, I am now marking out the height of my risers with my square, lining up my track saw to those marks, and then cutting it into strips that I'll cut down to length at my miter saw. Okay, so I finally finished cutting out every single piece for these stairs. That includes the risers that are going to sit in front of these risers, hardwood that are going to sit on top of these existing treads, the stair noses that are going to sit flush on the edge here, as well as the trim pieces that are going to go around the edges on each side and also under the stair nose to give it a little bit of body. The way I cut these out, mostly just using my miter saw, I measured the lengths with a tape measure, and then I used the existing riser that I cut from the first one and just kind of used it as a template going forward. So if one was slightly bigger, I'd cut it slightly bigger and just kind of trial and error to get them to fit. I always purposely cut them a little bit long. You can always take material off, you can't add material on. The stairs aren't totally square on each side. Some of them are actually quite a ways out of square. I just kind of went the quick route and went to assembly lined it using my miter saw and just cut them all at 90 degrees. I'm hoping that the gaps are going to be small enough to where I can cover them up with some caulk and paint so you won't see the gaps. I did number every single piece for every stair on the back so I know where to line them up as I'm staging it. So after I got all of the risers in place and brad nailed in, I went back with some caulk and a wet towel to fill in any cracks that were still existing. Alright, so now it's finally time to start installing the hardwood floors. These particular engineered hardwood floors have click-in edge profiles, so you don't actually have to glue them together. Similar to tongue and groove, you just line up the profiles and you can just snap them together, leaving a very seamless joint between the wood boards. On this first row, I line up my first board to the top stair nose of the lower section, and I have one other piece that I need to cut out a corner section to be able to have it sit flush on that landing. I make my marks just by lining my board up to the wall where it meets the edge of the stair and cutting out my piece. I use a miter saw for the crosscut section and a jigsaw for the rib section. For the remainder of the landing, I start by laying out all my boards and marking out where exactly I need to cut them, and just to get an idea of exactly how many I need to cut. I'm using the glue down method here. Not totally necessary, I believe you could just leave them floating there. But since it was such a small amount of boards, I went ahead and just put some construction adhesive down to get rid of any empty space that could be under the boards and cause any creaking. For the last little section, I just measure it out with my tape measure and then rip it down on the table saw. Finally, I just add on my cove molding trim that's going around all the edges. And I'm installing using my pin nailer. For the installation of the hardwoods on the stairs themselves, I start with the stair nose piece by putting a thick bead of construction adhesive and then laying the stair nose on the front edge of that stair and then pressing down as hard as I can to get the adhesive squeeze out, doing a couple yoga poses there to get as much pressure as I can. Then I get the hardwood boards down. Note that these hardwoods don't actually click into the stair nose since they're not the same brand or anything like that, but they do sit basically flush against that stair nose piece. And I make sure to put pressure on that joint to get those so they dry nice and lined up and close to each other.
Alright, got all the stairs installed. So now I just need to add the trim.
So this trim here to cover up any gaps is 3/4 inch cove molding cut at 45-degree miters in the corner. And I'm just using my pin nailer again to tack those in place using 1-inch pins. Next I got to work on the trim pieces that are going to sit on top of the stair skirts. These are going to cover that unfinished edge at the top of the stair skirt, and it's also going to be where I'm going to put the LED lights on the underside of this. I'm using 1x pine here and just adding a chamfered edge on one of the top corners just to give it more of an interesting profile. I'm using my router table here to do that, and then I'm staining these black and spray lacquered for finish.
So I'm working on this top piece that's going to sit on top of this baseboard, and I need to cut out these angles to make sure that the cuts are mitered properly. I'm just measuring this angle with the protractor, and I'm getting about 40. So to make my cut then, I need to have a 20-degree cut on this side and a 20-degree cut on this piece so that the cut lines up right around the middle of that angle. There's a 20-degree cut. Pretty close. Restain that a bit, but just so the lengths stay proper.
After getting all those boards routed and stained and lacquered, I cut them all to length to fit on the various parts of the stairs and just attaching them to the top of each stair skirt, getting them butting it right up against the wall, attaching using my brad nailer and 2-inch brads here. I did end up going back and refilling all the holes with wood filler and then staining in black. At this point the stairs were basically done, so now it's time to get to work on the LED lights. I wanted the LED wiring to actually be housed in this built-in bench that I have at the top of the stairs. I also wanted these lights to be on a switch so that I could easily turn them on and off when I'm going down the stairs. To start with the switch, I had to first drill a hole where the switch would eventually go, and then I needed to run a wire from that hole down into this built-in bench. So I'm using this wiring technique where you can drop a chain into the hole and fish it out using what's called a wet noodle, which is that yellow bendy thing that has a magnet on the end of it. Once you get that chain retrieved, you simply just have to take your wire, strip the ends, wrap it around the balls of the chain, and pull it back through pulling your wire with it. I had to run 2 different wires, one for the power going to the switch and one for the return power that would eventually be hooked up into my LED controller. Once I got my power wires through, I attached the switch and caulked around the edges.
Alright, just really quickly going to go through the wiring of the LEDs. I have my surge protector plugged into the wall, my power supply going into the surge protector. I just have my hot and my neutral going into the wall here, into the switch. The switch is returning the power out, going into my LED controller, which is the Shelly RGBW2, bringing the power neutral into the controller, and then I have the LED strip itself wired in here. That's going to go under the shelving area here, and that's going to pop out the bottom here and go into the strips that are going to go down the stairs. And I just have them on this switch here, so should theoretically control it. Now I'm just going to clean up all these wires and get them wrapped up and hidden under here. So starting from under the bench here, I have my extension cord, my RGBW extension cord going into the strip itself. I stripped both ends of the cords, twisted them together, and just banded it together with some electrical tape. And went ahead and installed the LED strips themselves. Installation's very simple. This is just peel and stick, so I took the plastic off and just pressed it against the bottom of this trim board. I did have a couple corners I had to go around. I just went ahead and bent the strip so that it would go around as tight as possible. You can also buy transition pieces where you have to cut the cord and install it. I went ahead and just bent it for this particular application for simplicity. And with that, the stairs are done. Thank you for watching this video. Hopefully you found it informative and got some inspiration for your own projects. If you have any questions about any particular part of the project, just please let me know in the comments. Now it's time for the final reveal shot with the obligatory ambient music background.